Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The War of 1812, and we're going to key in on 5 terms that you need to read about and think about to understand the topic a little better. Now, when it comes to talking about the War of 1812, let's be clear. I'm well aware of the fact that in this country, most of us don't care that much about the War of 1812. Maybe we have a relative that took us someplace that we looked at it and we went, what? Huh? Maybe we know they burned the White House. Maybe we know that Star Spangled Banner, maybe it's connected to it, or maybe somebody asked you a trivia question about whether or not it was only fought in 1812 or something like that. It's an important conflict for understanding the security of America in the early Republican period, but it is actually something that's important for our neighbors as well. The war actually helps the Canadians to really kind of think of themselves from a national identity perspective. So it's a conflict that if you ask certain scholars, the Americans win it. If you ask, Canadian scholars, they won it, right? So it's kind of interesting that way. All right, first term, impressment. Impressment was the process by which the Royal Navy would stop American ships and would capture Americans, sailors, and force them into service into the Royal Navy. Now, this is something that, of course, is viewed as a direct threat by those sailors who experience it, but is an assault on American sovereignty overall. And it's one of the reasons why President Madison issues the declaration of war in 1812, because this had happened hundreds of times. 2, Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader of a indigenous sort of confederacy by the time you get into the early 1800s, really against the encroachment of whites into the modern Midwest in this period. And he allies with the British and will play a very central role in fighting against the Americans kind of during this time. Now, he and his forces are eventually driven up to Canada, and he dies in a battle in 1813. But he was kind of important for that period and sort of looking at the indigenous experiences kind of within that particular space within the U.S. So Tecumseh. All right. Third would be Battle of York. Now, one of the most famous things that happens during the War of 1812, of course, is that the British are going to invade the U.S. They're going to march on Washington, D.C., and they're going to burn the executive mansion, what we call the White House today, and this was seen as a real tragedy. And it certainly was. But the Americans do this in Canada, right? We kind of do this too. And this is partly what comes in something called the Battle of York in 1813. Now, fourth big thing for us to kind of think about is going to be the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent is what brings this war to a close. It's signed in December 1814, and there's not that much that changes hands kind of with this conflict, right? So we kind of revert to a pre-war status quo. There's some questions over fishing rights and access and this kind of thing, but largely the British kind of recognize American sovereignty, and we kind of move forward. Now, fifth point is the Battle of New Orleans. Now, this happens just after the treaty was signed. Now, the joke we could give is, they didn't get the memo, or that kind of thing. But, communication's tough in 1814, 1815, so it's understandable. Now, Battle of New Orleans, you've got British forces in Louisiana. You've got this hodgepodge kind of mix of American militia and other forces under the command of General Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson, he becomes really nationally famous because of this battle. There weren't a lot of set-piece battles where the Americans have a decisive victory during the war, and Jackson gets one. Hundreds of British casualties, very few for the Americans. It's decisive. Jackson's very effective. They win. But it's a victory that kind of happens right at the end, and so it kind of catapults Jackson into this kind of national political discussion, and it eventually, by the 1820s, makes him a candidate for president, partly also because of his political ideologies, but this is really what propels Jackson kind of into the American story. All right, thanks so much.